in Jerusalem around AD 30. Jesus died on the cross, resurrected on the third day, and then ascended into heaven. 50 days after Jesus' resurrection, the Holy Spirit fell on the apostles, giving them power, purpose, and a plan. Out of joy, the church was born. Empowered by the Spirit, Peter gave his first sermon and 3,000 hearts were transformed. Hearing, receiving, and repenting, the young church walked in unity and garnered praise. Out of joy, the gospel creates community. Peter and John then continued to spread the gospel through preaching and miracles, and the church grew by 5,000. In AD 31, Stephen gave a powerful sermon, and the enraged crowd stoned him, making him the first Christian martyr. Around AD 34, on the road to Damascus, the Lord transformed the heart of Saul, a man who persecuted countless Christians, and Saul began to go by Paul. After this conversion, the gospel continued to spread through the ministries of Paul and Peter. God gave Peter a vision and used him to first reach the Gentiles. In AD 44, King Herod Agrippa I executed the apostle James and had Peter arrested, but an angel rescued Peter, leading him out of the prison. As the believers were scattered because of persecution, the center of operations for Christianity turned from Jerusalem to Antioch, where Paul and Barnabas were sent out on their first missionary journey. In AD 49, after an argument arose over circumcision, the Jerusalem Council sent a letter to the Gentiles affirming that it was not a requirement for salvation. Meanwhile, during a missionary journey, Paul and Barnabas disagreed over John Mark traveling with them, and they separated. Timothy and Luke then joined Paul as they spread the gospel throughout Asia Minor and Greece. Paul spent 3 months in Greece before traveling to Jerusalem, where he was arrested. Just as the church multiplied then, we must continue to multiply today. We must fuel the fire of multiplication as instruments of transformation both locally and globally, because the mission doesn't stop. And as we pursue this mission as a new church plant, we will go through difficulties. But through it all, we must remember that the church is unstoppable.
All right, good evening. How's everybody doing tonight? Welcome back to another service here at the Chapel Nordonia. My name's Pastor Chase. I'm glad to welcome you if you're in here or if you're tuning in online tonight. We're going to be in the book of Acts chapter 26 tonight. So if you have a Bible, go ahead and turn there. If you don't have a Bible, go ahead and just throw your hand up, and we have some of our ushers are walking around that will grab you a Bible and give one to you. That's our gift to you today. We believe here at the chapel, we believe that wasn't expecting that. Here at the chapel, we believe that the words that we're reading tonight are the very words of God. And so I think it's important that we're all looking at it together, so you can just throw your hand up and one of the ushers will bring you a Bible there. Like I said, tonight is going to be our second to last week in our series in the book of Acts. This is week 14, so we've been in Acts for, this is week 14. We'll wrap it up next week, but the video reminded us that we've been focusing every week on the fact that the church is unstoppable. Right? There's been many ups and downs all throughout church history. There's been many ups and downs even in our new church, and there's been many ups and downs in our lives as well. But through it all, God's plan is absolutely unstoppable. So that's what we're going to be talking about today, and Lord willing, we're going to go right up to the last chapter, the middle of the last chapter in Acts. But before we read together, even though we just saw that little video recap there, let me just kind of remind us of what's going on specifically in the story leading up to what we're talking about tonight. So in the book of Acts, the Apostle Paul, who kind of has become the main character in Acts in the second half of the book, he goes on 3 different missionary journeys. And so his third one wraps up in chapter 21, and we talked about that a little bit last week, how Paul was warned that if he was to go back to Jerusalem, it wasn't going to end well for him. Right? He was going to be locked up. He was going to end up in chains, and that's exactly what happens. He goes back to Jerusalem, and there's this series of court appearances and trials that he has. And so over the next several chapters, the Apostle Paul is either giving a defense for his faith, or he's sharing his testimony. And so this happens all the way up until chapter 24. And in chapter 24, Paul is on trial before a governor named Felix. And we talked about this last week, how Paul's main defense before Governor Felix was that he believed in the resurrection. His ministry, his life was centered around the resurrection. And we said last week that that's really the heart of our faith. Right? That's why we're here, because we really believe that there was a Judean carpenter who was actually killed and came back to life. And that's kind of the center of our faith. Amen? Well, Governor Felix ends up sending Paul away, and he basically puts him on house arrest for 2 years. And he and his wife are constantly visiting Paul, but he doesn't become a believer, even though Paul's constantly sharing the gospel with him. But in the end, Governor Felix, leaves Paul in prison, and that's where chapter 24 ends. And Felix is eventually replaced by this guy named Festus. And Festus doesn't really know what to make of Paul. Festus is a Roman and just sees this as a religious dispute. And so he's willing to send Paul back to Jerusalem. But Paul says, I don't want to go back to Jerusalem. Send me to Caesar. And Paul, who was a Roman citizen, if a Roman citizen demanded to be brought before Caesar, then he had to be brought before Caesar. So Festus had to send Paul to Caesar, but he didn't know exactly what to tell Caesar. Right? He didn't want to waste Caesar's time, and he knew that Paul was innocent. And you can't waste Caesar's time. That's how you end up getting killed back in ancient Rome. And so he calls on his friend Agrippa, who's King Herod Agrippa. And so what we see is that Paul gives this amazing defense in Acts chapter 26 before King Herod Agrippa of his faith and his testimony. He talks about being on the road to Damascus and being blinded by this light and coming to faith in Jesus. And so that's where I want to pick up at the end of Acts chapter 26 when Paul is giving his defense before Festus and Agrippa. And so I'm going to start reading in verse 24. Acts chapter 26, verse 24. And I'm going to read to the end of the chapter, even though we're going to spend most of our time focusing on the next chapter. Acts 26, verse 24, it says, And as he was saying these things in his defense, Festus said with a loud voice, Paul, you are out of your mind. Your great learning is driving you out of your mind. But Paul said, I am not out of my mind, most excellent Festus, but I am speaking true and rational words. For the king knows about these things, and to him I speak boldly. For I am persuaded that none of these things has escaped his notice, for this has not been done in a corner. King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know that you believe. And Agrippa said to Paul, in a short time, would you persuade me to be a Christian? See, Agrippa's a smart guy. He realizes that Paul's trying to convert him, and he says, are you trying to make me a Christian here? In verse 29, and Paul said, whether short or long, I would to God that not only you, but also all who hear me this day might become such as I am, except for these chains. Then the king rose, and the governor and Bernice and those who were sitting with them. And when they had withdrawn, they said to one another, this man is doing nothing to deserve death or imprisonment. And Agrippa said to Festus, this man could have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar. Let's pray, and then we'll pick up there with the story. Father, thank you for your word. Thank you for this evening that we can come and study your word. Lord, I pray that we will learn about you tonight, but most importantly, that we won't just learn a series of facts and information, but that you'll use these words to transform our hearts so that we can live boldly for you. Lord, may I speak clearly in this moment. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be pleasing to you, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. The word phobia is by definition an irrational fear of something that's unlikely to cause harm. The word comes from the Greek word phobos, which means fear, and many of us in this room, if not all of us, probably have one or many different phobias, different irrational fears. I did a quick Google search of the top 100 phobias that people all over the world share, and I'm not going to share the whole list with you, but I'm going to share some of these with you. The first one is arachnophobia. That's the most popular. It's the fear of spiders. That's by far the highest. It's also pretty high on my list of questions I'm going to ask God when I get to heaven. Like, did you need to add 8 legs? You couldn't just, 4 is not creepy enough. Number 2 is opidiophobia. It's the fear of snakes. Number 6 is astrophobia. It's the fear of storms. Number 7, claustrophobia. This is one that I struggle with, the fear of being in tight and enclosed spaces. Number 12 is thanatophobia, the fear of death. And this is a worldwide list. Actually, the next one, number 13, in the U.S. is higher than the fear of death, and that's glossophobia. That's the fear of public speaking. That's where many of you probably heard the joke about how people feel more comfortable in the casket than delivering the eulogy, because in the U.S., people are more afraid of public speaking than death. Number 26, this is my favorite, hepatomonstроsis quipedaliophobia. I practice saying that one. That's the fear of long words. I just had to throw that one in there because I like that. And then number 96 on the list was thalassophobia, which is the fear of the open ocean. So not just the beach or a cruise ship, but the fear of the deep, dark, unknown beneath the crashing waves, right? And if that description made you nervous, then you probably have thalassophobia. So why am I talking to you about phobias? Well, because in these final 2 chapters in the book of Acts, we see some of the most well-known and memorable stories in the entire book. And part of the reason I think these stories are so well-known and widely spread are because they contain every one of those phobias that was on that list, except for arachnophobia. So even the fear of long words is going to make an appearance tonight. So if you've got any one of those other phobias, you might get a little bit uncomfortable tonight. Yet what we see here is that in these final 2 chapters, even in the most terrifying and fear-inducing moments, God is not only right in the middle of all of these terrifying situations, but God is able to use these terrifying situations for His glory so that His name may be spread all over the earth. And so I want you to know tonight that whether you came in here, riding a spiritual wave and on a spiritual high, or if it took everything for you to come in here or to turn on the live stream and you just feel like you're hitting rock bottom, I want you to know that God is with you even in the midst of the darkest situations, and that's what we're going to see here tonight. So with that said, let's pick up reading at the beginning of Acts chapter 27. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you 3 of those phobias that we mentioned and kind of focus on those 3 parts of the story. And so the first situation, the first fear-inducing situation that we're going to see tonight is the storm. The storm. So Acts 27, starting in verse 1, and it says, "And when it was decided that we should all sail for Italy, they delivered Paul and some of the other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. And embarking on a ship of Adramyttium, which is a port near Caesarea, that's what that is, which was about to sail ports across the coast of Asia, we put to sea accompanied with Aristarchus, a Macedonian man from Thessalonica." Jump down to verse 4. "And putting out to sea from where we sailed under the lee of Cyprus, because of the winds were against us, and when we had sailed across the open sea along the coast of Sicilia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra in Lycia. There the centurion found a ship of Alexandria sailing for Italy and put us on board. We sailed slowly for a number of days and arrived with difficulty off Cnidus. And as the wind did not allow for us to go farther, we sailed under the lee of Crete off Salmone. Coasting along with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens, near which was the city of Lasea." Now, I know most of these names don't mean a lot to us. I'm going to show us a map in just a second here. But most of those names probably don't mean a lot to us. But Luke, the author of the book of Acts, what he's pointing out several times for us now is that this journey was difficult. Right? There was a lot of difficulty on this journey. Verse 9, "Since much time had passed, and the voyage was now dangerous because even the fast was already over, Paul advised them, saying, 'Sirs, I perceive that the voyage will be with injury and much loss, not only of cargo and the ship, but also of our lives. But the centurion paid more attention to the pilot and to the owner of the ship than to what Paul said. And because the harbor was not suitable to spend the winter in, the majority decided to put out to sea from there on the chance that somehow they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete, facing both southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there. Okay, so let me show you some maps so that hopefully this will make a little bit of sense. So if we can go to the very first map on here. So this is the map of Paul's journey to Rome. They're trying to start down there near Jerusalem, and they're trying to get up there to Rome, which you see is near Italy. And so they started at Caesarea, which is the next slide there. And they started at Caesarea, and then they made it up to Sidon there, which is the next slide. And then they went around Cyprus, and they went to a place called Myra. And then they went down to a place called Cnidus, and then they sailed down to a place called Fair Havens. And so this Fair Havens was on what's called the island of Crete. And you can see, can you go back real quick? Back 2 slides. There we go. So Fair Havens is on the island of Crete, and you can see right next to it there's Phoenix. So they're trying to make it from Fair Havens to Phoenix. However, something happens that delays their plans. And Paul knows that they probably shouldn't try and leave. Once they made it to Fair Haven safely, Paul knows that they shouldn't go anywhere. Why? Because winter is coming. Or winter is on the way. And Luke tells us that the fast was over. The fast was that's what's the Day of Atonement, or Yom Kippur. And so Paul was an experienced sailor. Paul had been on several different missionary journeys. And so he realizes that, hey, when it starts to get towards Yom Kippur, which is around October, that's a dangerous, dangerous time to be on the open ocean. One commentator said this that gives a helpful insight. Navigation in this part of the Mediterranean was always dangerous after September 14th. And it was considered impossible after November 11th. And now it's late October, and so Paul is basically saying, hey, listen up, guys. We're not going to make it. We made it to Fair Havens. That's a blessing. Let's stay here. We'll camp out here for the winter, and then we'll set sail for Italy later, but they don't listen to him. And why would they listen to him, right? Paul's a prisoner, and so they listen to the pilot, as most of us probably would. Now, a quick side note, I told you this was going to include all of our phobias, so go back to that picture of the boat if you can. This is kind of the boat that they were on. And it might seem like this was a big boat that they were going to have plenty of room in that boat, but we're told later that there were 276 people on that boat. So they had to be crammed very tight, especially Paul is a prisoner, so he's in chains. So just the thought of that makes me pretty claustrophobic. It's pretty terrifying, especially to be in a storm. I don't know if anyone's seen the movie Ben-Hur, the old Ben-Hur movie, when they're in the belly of the boat and they're all in chains and they start going under, and it's just terrifying. That might be the origin of my fear of my claustrophobia. But anyway, let's pick up in verse 13. Verse 13, now when the south wind blew gently, supposing that they had obtained their purpose, they weighed anchor and sailed along Crete, close to the shore. But soon a tempestuous wind called the northeaster struck down from the land. Now, depending on your translation, there might be a different name. Some of the translations call it the northeaster. Some of them call it the Euroclydon. Either way, it's a storm. A Euroclydon sounds a lot more terrifying. A northeaster sounds like, there's Easter eggs flying around. But if a Euroclydon is coming after you, that's bad news, right? There's no hope. It's going to end poorly. And so they're stuck in the middle of this hurricane, this storm called the Euroclydon. And look what happens in verse 15. And when the ship was caught and could not face the wind, we gave way to it and were driven along. Running under the lee of a small island called Cauda, we managed with great difficulty to secure the ship's boat. After hoisting it up, they used supports to undergird the ship. Then, fearing that they would run aground in Syrtis, they lowered the gear and thus were driven along. So in other words, they've given up steering. Okay, the ship or the storm is so bad that they're just adrift. They're just floating in the middle of this storm, and they just don't know what they're going to do. Verse 18, since we were violently storm-tossed, they began the next day to jettison the cargo, and on the third day they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. When neither the sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest lay on us, all of our hope of being saved was at last abandoned. Okay, so their back is completely to the wall. They know that the end is near. right? They know that they're on, that they better do something or else they're going to die. And how do we know that they took this seriously? Well, we know that they took it seriously because they're throwing all of their cargo overboard. Like, these are professional sailors. Their life-saving is in what they're transporting on this ship. And they're throwing it over because they realize that it's either they toss it over or they're going to die. It reminds me of the story of Jonah. Right? In the book of Jonah, God sent the storm, and the sailors were so afraid that they start throwing all of their stuff overseas. In the late 1800s, there was a Turkish wrestler named Yusuf Ismail. I meant to put a picture up, but I didn't get a picture of him. But he's a Turkish wrestler, and that was his real name, Yusuf Ismail, but he went by the name the Terrible Turk. And he was a champion wrestler in his country. I brought this as I share this story. He was a champion wrestler, and the reason I brought this, he was a big guy. He was 6'3", over 320 pounds, and he would wear a championship belt, and in his belt, he kept all of his money. And he converted all of his money to gold, and he would keep it in his belt, and he would just wear it around. And it sounds like a terrible idea, but if your name's the Terrible Turk, like, who's going to mess with you? Right? No one's going to take your money if your name's the Terrible Turk. And so he came to America in the 1800s to wrestle a guy named Strangler Lewis. All the wrestlers had those kind of nicknames and stuff. And so he's going to wrestle Strangler Lewis, and he did, and he won, and he earned $5,000, which in today's money is worth $160,000. And he asked that all of that money be converted to gold so that he could keep that money in his belt. This is a true story. On his way back over, after he finished wrestling in the tournament and just destroying everybody, he had about $10,000 to $15,000 worth of gold in his belt. And their ship hit a storm, and he was thrown overboard, and that gold belt basically turned into an anchor, and he sunk down all the way to his death. And it reminds me of one of the Proverbs that says, riches will not help on the day of wrath. Right? Proverbs 11:4. Riches will not help on the day of wrath. And that's what we see happening here in the book of Acts. It doesn't matter how much money these sailors had. It doesn't matter how much potential they had to make money with their cargo, because they're not going to make it to the next port. And so they realize they need to throw everything overboard because the storm is so serious. Many of us might have come in here tonight, or maybe you're watching online, feeling like you're in a metaphorical storm in your life. Right? The storm clouds are rolling in, whether it's the storms of uncertainty in health or financial uncertainty, or maybe things aren't working out well at home or at work, whatever it is, you found yourself like the sailors, so overwhelmed and in a storm in your life that you realize that money alone is not going to solve the problem. Well, if that's you tonight, let me just say, first of all, that you're not alone. That there's a God who loves you, and whether or not you can feel his presence or not, maybe you're like the sailors and you feel like you're in just complete and total darkness. They were in complete darkness for 2 weeks, and maybe you say, yeah, I can kind of relate to that feeling. Well, let me tell you that God is with you even in the face of the worst difficulties. In the most trying times, even in the storms of life, God's promises can be trusted. And that's what we're going to see when we keep reading. Look at verse 21. Verse 21, since they had been without food for a long time, Paul stood up among them and said, men, you should have listened to me and not have set sail from Crete and incurred this injury and loss. Don't you love that? I bet Paul didn't make any new friends with that one. Right? They're in the darkness, they're hungry for 2 weeks, and Paul stands up and says, I told you. But the next couple verses are where the encouragement comes. Verse 22, yet now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. Okay, so that's good news and bad news. The good news is nobody's going to die. The bad news is the ship is going under. Right? That's the bad news. Verse 23, for this very night there stood before me an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I worship. And he said, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar. And behold, God has granted you all of those who sail with you. So take heart, men, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told. But we must run aground on some island. Which leads to the second phobia, the shipwreck. right? There was kind of a phobia in there as well as Paul stood up talking before people, right? The fear of public speaking. But the shipwreck is the next big phobia that I want to focus on. No one's going to die. That's the good news. Paul has this message from God that they're going to be fine. Their lives are going to be spared, but they're going to crash. And there's going to be a disaster. But even in this disaster, there's a message from God. Even in this dark and terrible situation they're in, they received a message from God. And so have you and I. God never told us that the Christian life was going to be easy. In fact, the opposite is true. Sometimes our lives are actually made more difficult by the fact that we're Jesus followers. Matthew chapter 5, Jesus tells his disciples that the rain falls on the just and the unjust alike. And what's he talking about? He's saying that God provides this blessing of rain to people, whether they're Christians or not. If you're a farmer, you're not only getting the rain if you're a Christian farmer. No, unjust people get the rains as well. But on the flip side of that, the just and the unjust alike both experience difficulties. Being a Christian isn't a safeguard from ever getting sick or from ever going through financially difficult situations. And again, sometimes our lives are actually made more difficult by the fact that we're followers of Jesus. Persecution of whatever level might arise. But the message of the gospel is not that we can avoid all of the storms, but that Jesus will be with us even in the middle of the storms. And how amazing is it that Paul, he's with all of these sailors, going through the same exact thing that all these sailors are going through, but he receives a message from Jesus. That Jesus was with Paul in the middle of the storm. And again, God is with us in the middle of the storms of our lives. Well, we're not waiting for new revelation from God or a new vision of God, but no, God has given us everything that we need to know about him in his word. Psalm 46:1 says, God is our refuge and our strength, a very present help in trouble. Psalm 55, verse 22, cast your burden on the Lord, and he will sustain you. He will never permit the righteous to be moved. So we should be listening to God. We should be listening to God by reading his scripture, by praying, even when we're in the middle of the storm. But remember, it wasn't just a storm. No, there was a shipwreck as well. Look at verse 27. When the 14th night had come, side note, quick, the word 14th in the Greek, I think I have a slide of it here. That's the word 14th in the Greek. It's tessar eschadeketas, which if you have hepatomonstроsis, quipedaliophobia, that might trigger you a little bit there. But anyway, verse 27, when the 14th night had come, as we were being driven across the Adriatic Sea, about midnight, the sailors suspected that they were nearing land. So they took a sounding and found 20 fathoms. A little farther on, they found a sounding again and found 15 fathoms. And fearing that we might run on the rocks, they let down 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. Acts chapter 27 is actually one of the most detailed accounts that we have of ancient mariners and navigation, nautical navigation in the ancient world. And so this passage right there is actually studied a lot by Christians and non-Christians alike. So that's just remarkable how trustworthy this account is. But jump down to verse 39. Now when it was day, they did not recognize the land, but they noticed a bay with a beach, on which they planned, if possible, to run the ship ashore. So they cast off the anchors and left them in the sea, at the same time loosening the ropes that tied the rudders, then hoisting the foresail to the wind, they made for the beach. Okay, so what they're doing is they're going to try and attempt a crash landing on the beach, and hopefully the boat is going to stay intact, but that's not going to work. They should have just listened to Paul. Paul told them they were going to wreck. And that's what we see in verse 41. But striking a reef, they ran the vessel aground. The bow stuck and remained immovable, and the stern was being broken up by the turf. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, a little bit of an overreaction, lest any of them should swim away and escape, but the centurion, wishing to save Paul, kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and make for the land, and the rest on the planks or on pieces of the ship. And so it was that all were brought safely to land. So they abandoned ship They're riding into the island on broken pieces of the ship, but remarkably, all of them made it. Right? They all made it alive. This is an awful, awful situation, but how remarkable is it that all 276 of them made it alive? See, sometimes it's hard to find, but have you ever stopped to thank God for the small blessings even in the middle of the storm? King David in the Old Testament, he went through some storms that would make many of ours pale in comparison. I know a lot of us have gone through difficult circumstances, but I don't think we've ever had the king of an entire nation trying to kill us. But yet King David, even in the midst of these great storms he went through, he was always praising God, even in the middle of the storm. Psalm 7 is a great example of this. It starts out like this: "O Lord my God, in you do I take refuge. Save me from all my pursuers and deliver me, lest like a lion they tear my soul apart, rendering it in pieces with none to deliver." That's a difficult situation. He feels like people are going to just tear him apart. And yet, even in the middle of that circumstance, look at how he ends this psalm in Psalm 7. The last verse, it says, "I will give to the Lord the thanks due to his righteousness, and I will sing praise to the name of the Lord Most High." See, not only does God hear us in the middle of the storm, but we should cry out to God and praise God because he can hear us in the middle of the storm, whether we can hear him yet or not. And believe it or not, God is still with this situation that Paul's in, even though it's not clear yet how. And it's about to get a little worse. There's another phobia coming up here, another phobia scenario, the third and final one. This is actually in the beginning of chapter 28, and here comes the snake. You can say, how is it possibly going to get worse? They've already crashed onto an island, but isn't that how life just works sometimes? Like the negativity just keeps piling on, and things just seem to be getting worse and worse. As the saying, when it rains, it pours. And that's exactly what we're going to see here. So let's throw the map up one more time. I think we have the map on the next slide. So again, they were at Fair Havens. They were trying to make it over to Phoenix. But then what happened? The Euroclydon threw them off trail. And so they ended up being caught out in the middle there. And so they were just floating around. They didn't know which way was left and right. And they were just floating and off adrift. And then they ended up crashing onto this island called Malta over there. And so that's where they've crash landed. And that's where chapter 28 starts. It says, "After we were brought safely through, we learned that the island was called Malta." Luke, who's the author of Acts, is kind of using a play on words here because Malta means refuge. So he's basically saying after we found refuge, we found that the island was called Refuge. In verse 2, it says, "The native people showed us unusual kindness, for they kindled a fire and welcomed us all because it had begun to rain and was cold. When Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and put them on the fire, a viper came out because of the heat and fastened onto his hand." Okay, so how is this situation going to get any worse? You don't think it could get any worse at all. Paul was arrested in Jerusalem, and then there was a storm, and then they shipwrecked, and now he has a snake hanging off of his hand. And the people that Paul was with thought that this must have been Paul's fault. That was kind of his worldview. Like, if your life is that messed up, then you must have done something to deserve that. That's what the people are thinking. But look at what happens in verse 5. He, Paul, however, shook off the creature into the fire and suffered no harm. See, Paul knew the promises of God. Paul knew that God had promised that he was going to make it to stand before Caesar. And so Paul realizes now this snake isn't going to mess up God's plan. And so what happens? I love verse 6. Verse 6, it says they were waiting for him to swell up and suddenly fall dead. Right? So they're just thinking, yeah, it's over. He's done. But when they had waited a long time and saw no misfortune come to him, they changed their minds and said that he was a god. So they go from one extreme to the other. And the Bible doesn't tell us here that Paul started preaching the gospel to them, but I think we can be assured with the most confidence that he did. Why? Because he's Paul. And that's what Paul does. And so let me just finish the story here. Verse 7, "Now in the neighborhood of that place were lands belonging to the chief man of the island named Publius, who received us and entertained us hospitably for 3 days. It happened that the father of Publius lay sick with fever and dysentery." Okay, so this time it's just got to seem like a cosmic joke, right? You go from, again, being arrested in Jerusalem, then there's a storm, then there's a shipwreck, now there's snake bites and fevers and dysentery. It's like some weird game of Oregon Trail. But this is yet another opportunity for God to show that he's even in the midst of all of these terrible, terrible situations. Look at verse 8. And Paul visited him and prayed, and putting his hands on him, he healed him. And when this had taken place, the rest of the people on the island who had diseases also came and were cured. They also honored us greatly, and when we were about to sail, they put on board whatever we needed. So they finally made it to Rome, and there was more wind in the next couple verses, but this time they got to where they needed to go. And let me just, verse 16 is the last verse we'll read tonight. Verse 16, and when we had come to Rome, Paul was allowed to stay by himself with the soldier who guarded him. So he's finally in Rome. He's under house arrest here, and most people believe he would have been literally chained to another Roman guard, and when the Roman guards would switch shifts, they would just switch the chains, and Paul was always chained to someone. And what we'll see next week is this was essentially the end of Paul's life. He would be on house arrest for a number of years, and then he would be executed by Nero. So again, we go from getting beaten by this mob in Jerusalem to then being caught in this terrible storm, to then a shipwreck, to then getting bit by a snake, and there's a snake hanging off of his arm that came out of a fire. Fire's scary too. And so then he goes, and he's surrounded by death and sickness, and then he's under house arrest for 2 years, and then he faces his own death and execution. Now, that's awful, right? That's an awful way to end your life. Well, it is, but it isn't. It is because these are situations that none of us would ever want to go through, but it's not, because what we're going to see is that Paul was right in the center of God's will. Right? God was able to use even these worst moments of Paul's life for his glory. And see, there's a reason that Paul wanted to go to Rome in the first place. Right? There was a saying that all roads lead to Rome. It still is a saying, but it's a metaphorical saying now. But all the roads used to lead into Rome. And so if all the roads lead into Rome, then that means all the roads lead out of Rome. And so that means if Paul was able to saturate Rome with the gospel, then the gospel message would overflow out of Rome and reach the ends of the earth. And we're here today because we are the ends of the earth. We're here today largely because of those trials and difficulties that Paul went through at the end of his life. And it's easy to think, God could have used some other easier way. Or Paul could have just preached a regular message when he was on that boat. But I don't think that would have had the same power and impact as Paul being there with them in the middle of that storm and standing up and saying, hey, listen, the God that I serve, the one who made the sea, he told me we're going to be fine. And then Paul was able to share the gospel with all those who were sick all around. And listen, I don't want to stand here, I don't want you to think I'm saying that what Paul went through, that those difficulties were good. No, they were not good, but God used those terrible and broken and messed up situations in Paul's life. And again, now we're here largely today because God used those situations to make much of his name. And this is where it begins to tie directly into our life today. Because again, many of us may be in those situations where we don't know why in the world we're in these situations. Maybe it's a loss of a job or even the loss of a loved one or health or wealth, uncertainty and whatever it is. We don't know why we're in that situation. Or maybe we actually do. Maybe we're the ones who caused that situation and we know that the storm that we're in is terrible and dark, and we're just blaming ourselves and we don't think God can use this situation in any way. Well, I'm here to tell you, both from the testimony of the Apostle Paul, from the testimony all throughout church history, from my own experience, that God can use the worst moments in our lives, and he can get all the glory, and his kingdom will be advanced. Many of us know the story of Horatio Spafford, the successful lawyer and businessman in the late 1800s. He had a lovely wife named Anna and 5 kids, and it was in 1871 that his only son, died with pneumonia. And that same year, his entire business went up in flames in the Great Chicago Fire. And then just 2 years later, on November 21st, 1873, there was a French ocean liner that was crossing the Atlantic, and his wife and his 4 daughters were on that ship. And it collided with another ship. And the mother gathered her 4 daughters as the ship was sinking, and together they prayed that God would spare them if it would be his will, or that he would make them willing to endure whatever was to await them. But within 12 minutes, the ship sank completely into the dark waters of the Atlantic Ocean, carrying with it 226 passengers, 4 of which were Horatio Spafford's 4 daughters. Later that night, a sailor was rowing over to the spot where the ship had went down, and he spotted Anna, Horatio Spafford's wife, and she was still alive, and he pulled her into the boat and took her to safety, and she was able to send one message to her husband, and it just said, "Saved alone, what shall I do?" Another of the ship's survivors later said that Anna was saying, "God gave me 4 daughters, now they have been taken from me. Someday I may understand why." Horatio Spafford booked the next ship so that he could join his grieving wife, and while the ship was 4 days out, the captain called him in his cabin and told him that they were over the waters where his 4 daughters had perished. And Horatio Spafford, in that moment, sailing over the waters where he lost his family, wrote these words. He said, "When peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul." How can someone who goes through such unspeakable tragedy and death turn around and write words like that have been the comfort to countless Christians all throughout the years? And better yet, how can we expect to look in the face of tragedy and uncertainty in our own lives and have that same mentality? Well, it's by having the same anchor that Horatio Spafford had, which was the same anchor that the Apostle Paul had, and that's the anchor of faith in the one who created us. That's the only way that we can make it through the difficulties and the storms of life. So there may be times like Paul when we may be able to see some of the fruit come out of the difficult situations and circumstances that we're in, but not every time. There may be times when we actually do get to find out why God put us in those dark and trying storms, but not every time. People ask me all the time, why do bad things happen to Christians? And many times the answer is simply, I don't know. Many times we may never know on this side of heaven. But what we do know is that there's a God who's with us in the storm. A God who encourages us, a God who's given us everything that we need to make it through the storm. And listen to me, God himself came down from heaven and entered into our world of pain and sorrow and suffering. And that God who became like one of us was the one who trampled over the waves. He's the one who calmed the storm, the one who looked straight into the face of persecution and death and didn't cower away, but he was led to a cross. And the Apostle Paul was bitten by a snake bite, and he survived, but Jesus was led to the cross, and he was killed. But what we know is that in Jesus' death and resurrection, he trampled over the head of the snake. And so now, if we're followers of Jesus, we can truly say, like David, that even when the storms of life hit, even if we find ourselves in the valley of the shadow of death, whatever that might look like in our life, we don't have to be afraid because we have an anchor that holds steadfast in the storm. And so I've got to ask this evening, do you have that anchor? Can you say with the most confidence that when the storms of life hit, not if, but when the storms of life hit, you can have the peace that passes all understanding, like Paul talks about in Philippians? It doesn't mean that we don't feel fear or pain or anxiety, but it means that we can have that security, that hope that we can only have with faith in Jesus. And if you're not sure exactly what this means, you don't know if you have that hope, maybe you're going through some difficulties in your own lives and you just don't know how you're going to make it through this storm, I'd love to talk with you before you leave. I'll be down here after the service. We'll have people over by Next Steps table who would love to talk with you. Let me close with the words of a poem by Henry Van Dyke. Henry Van Dyke was an American Presbyterian clergyman about 150 years ago, and he wrote a book of poems and sermons that were compiled in 1911. And this poem here, I don't think there's any way or any more poem that's more applicable to Paul's journey and Paul's experience and many of our experience as well. So let me close with these words. It says, O maker of the mighty deep, let me try it again. O maker of the mighty deep, whereon our vessels fare, above our lives' adventure keep thy faithful watch and care. In thee we trust, whatever befall, thy sea is great, our boats are small. We know not where the secret tides will help us or delay, nor where the lurking tempest tides, nor where the skies are gray. We trust in thee, whatever befall. Thy sea is great, our boats are small. Beyond the circle of the sea, when voyaging is past, we seek our final part in thee. Oh, bring us home at last. In thee we trust, whatever befall. Thy sea is great, our boats are small. Our boats are small in this vast sea that we call life, where there's every terror and storm and wave and phobia surrounding us. Well, friends, we have an anchor in the mighty name of Jesus. And let's not forget that he's with us, even in the middle of the storm. Let me pray. Father, thank you that you're not a God who just stands far away and just watches the world unfold, but you entered into our pain and suffering. You were able to do what we could not do for ourselves. And so, Lord, I pray for anyone here who's in the middle of a difficult situation where they see no way out, that you will cause them to cast their eyes on you, that you may become evident in their lives. And Lord, for all of us, whether we ever find out the reason why things happen in our lives, that we won't get so caught up focusing on the why, but we'll just focus on the who and realize that you're with us even in the storm. It's in Jesus' name that we pray. Amen.
This has been a message from the Chapel. Thanks for joining us today. For more information about the Chapel or any of our campuses, including Akron, Greene, Wadsworth, Kenmore, Cuyahoga Falls, and Nordonia, please go to our website at thechapel.life.